So this video is based on exchange rates, and we're specifically looking at managed exchange rates. So what is a managed exchange rate? It's kind of in between a free floating exchange rate and a fixed exchange rate. So what I mean by that is it's got characteristics of both, but it'll allow the exchange rate, or the currency value, sorry, to freely float in the market. And what I mean by that is it's pretty much dictated by market forces, but only up to a certain range. And they'll select a range based on obviously what's beneficial to their country and their international trade. Now, if it remains within that range, the central bank won't intervene. But if it goes from outside of that range, then obviously the central bank will intervene because it's going against what their country is, I suppose, trying to achieve. Now, we'll look at how they exactly do that later on in the video. But to begin with, let's have a look at a couple of countries who do have a managed exchange rate. So to begin with, we've got China. Now, we know how reliant China is on international trade. They're one of the biggest exporters in the world. They export to every single continent in large volumes, and therefore the exchange rate is absolutely essential to China. But they do allow it to freely float up until a certain point. But if it goes out of that range, and it now becomes actually that Chinese exports are not very competitive, or they're becoming too expensive and they're losing that attractiveness of how cheap they were previously, then obviously the Chinese government don't want that. So the Chinese government will step in and they'll intervene. Now, Algeria is another example. So Algeria is also reliant on international trade, and the reason for that is because of their oil and gas. Their oil and gas accounts for 90% of their exports and 60% of their total income, and they're among the top 5 largest gas exporters in the world and rank 16th in oil reserves. So clearly, a key commodity such as oil, which is contributing to a massive percentage of their total national income, they really require that demand to be as competitive as possible. And if it gets to a point where maybe their exchange rate is uncompetitive now and they're losing that demand for oil, that's going to have a massive impact on Algeria. And if we think about what's happened in the last year with COVID and how oil prices have dropped, that's really going to hurt Algeria, and it has hurt Algeria. So obviously when they're looking at their exchange rates, they want to kind of reduce and remove any potential shocks or uncertainty, and they want to make sure that exchange rate is healthy and therefore it's managed, just to avoid any future or additional issues that they're already facing. Now, in terms of how you calculate a managed exchange rate, let's imagine we're looking at the UK and the US, and let's imagine the current exchange rate is £1 to $1.2 US. All right. Let's imagine the Bank of England and the government are actually quite happy with that, but they want to keep it within a range. So let's say they want to either side maybe 2%. All right, and what they've done is they've set an upper limit and they've set a lower limit. And what they want to do is they want to make sure that, supply and demand may fluctuate, the pounds to the US dollar, it may change slightly, but not from outside of that range. Because let's imagine that something happened. Let's imagine that there was the demand for pounds fell, and there's a depreciation of the pound, and it went from D to D2. That's obviously outside of the range now, which the Bank of England and the government won't be happy about. So they'll step in to intervene. Now, how they'll do it is they've got billions and billions of pounds worth of reserves at the central bank, but they've also got other foreign reserves as well, and other foreign currencies. So what they might do, they might get some of their foreign currency reserves, and they may use that to buy pounds. And by doing so, it's going to increase the demand of pounds and get it back within that limit. And as we can see there, maybe D3, just getting it back. But it is expensive to do so. And that's one of the issues when you do intervene, and that's one of the issues with a fixed exchange rate, is the cost of that intervention. Because obviously with a fixed exchange rate, that intervention is ongoing. All right? With a managed exchange rate, it's less frequent, and it's only there if they have to. Now, there's different types of managed exchange rates. We're only going to have a look at a couple, but the first one is an adjustable peg. And that's quite similar to what I've just done in that diagram. So the value of the exchange rate can be changed as circumstances require. So they won't be always doing it. It will depend if something's happened, maybe a shock, maybe something they didn't expect, or maybe a global impact on the country and on their exchange rate, and they've had to intervene. And because they're not doing it so often, it's because they've set a realistic and a flexible I suppose, range. So I've given the example of 2% like I did in the last diagram, and maybe they believe 2% either or on that exchange rate is realistic. They probably won't have to change too much, or they won't have to intervene too much. But when there are shocks or when there are events that take place and they do need to, then the central bank will step in and they will intervene, and that's where the managed aspect comes in. Now, when we've got a crawling peg, that is much more managed than the adjustable one. Now, the crawling peg will be reviewed, it'll be monitored, it will be acted upon much more frequently. And therefore, as I've put there, the currency is adjusted periodically in small amounts at a fixed rate or in response to changes in selective quantitative indicators. So what I mean by that is some of the indicators that they might have, it could be inflation, it could be inflation differentials between the two countries, especially that of a major trading partner. And if they believe that that inflation is going to have an impact on international trade, they may adjust the exchange rate just to kind of make sure that inflation doesn't have that much of an impact and the trading can continue. Now, maintaining a crawling peg imposes constraints on monetary policy, just like it would do with a fixed exchange rate. And the reason being is because the monetary policy is prioritising the exchange rate maybe over other domestic factors, such as possibly inflation. And therefore it kind of limits them in the other policies. But I'll delve into that much more in a fixed exchange rate. Right, so why would they do it? What are the benefits of doing it? Well, you kind of get the benefits of both worlds. You're benefiting of a free-floating system, but you've still got the option to intervene. So what that does, it minimises the risks associated with the uncertainty of allowing market forces to dictate the exchange rate. But if a currency value obviously increases or decreases too rapidly, then the central bank can intervene. So it's got the benefits of a fixed exchange rate as well. So what it does is it's pretty much less expensive than a fixed exchange rate. It requires less ongoing intervention, and it probably results in less policy constraints and policy conflicts, especially with monetary policy. But it is worth pointing out, if you don't have to intervene, perfect. But if you do have to intervene, then some of the issues that we'll look at with a fixed exchange rate come into play with this as well. And it can be very expensive, and it can cost and go into the central bank's reserves.